So, welcome everyone watching, and welcome to my guest today, Dr. Golan Broshi, who is a professor of biblical studies, specifically an expertise in Rabbinic Judaism and the interaction between that and New Testament beliefs. So, first of all, thank you for joining me today. It's an honor,
תודה
Professor.
רבה, שלום, thank you, Asha.
Shalom. And so, what we're going to do today is I've talked about it in a few videos. I've gone over it, but my knowledge compared to yours is not. I mean, this is your life study, so I'm very honored to have you here to go into the depths of it a little bit more. So before getting into it, we're going to talk about a little bit about Rabbinic Judaism, the history of it, how it came to be, some of the inconsistencies in the claims as to how it follows the Tanakh, and if we have time, go into maybe how it is actually the New Testament beliefs in Jesus as the Messiah and Yeshua, more consistent in following the Tanakh, to get your perspective on that. So I think you froze there a little bit for a second. No, you're good. So before getting into
I can
it,
hear you.
maybe just a short background on how you came to be where you are today.
Okay, so and it's going to be briefly, and I'm sorry, apologize in advance for my Israeli accent, but I was born in a small kibbutz in the really northern part of Israel on the border of Lebanon, a really atheistic social community full of immigrants from East Europe that fled either before the Holocaust or after the Holocaust, and the best way to survive was in kind of a social communist environment where you don't have anything, but you share everything, and nothing is yours, but everything is yours in the kibbutz. Kind of like the fellas, the disciples of Yeshua in Acts 2 and 4, when they shared everything and had not everything in common. I grew up, and praise the Lord, in this kibbutz we had an ulpan. An ulpan is where new immigrants come to study Hebrew, and that's their first year in Israel when they study, or half a year in Israel when they study Hebrew. What they work one day in the kibbutz and stay for half a year or something like that. And we had an ulpan, and most of the members of the ulpan were immigrants from Russia or East Europe. But in this ulpan came also volunteers from the nations, Gentiles volunteers that came just to see the Israeli experience from the kibbutz perspective. And most of them were, I didn't know that, but Messianic believers, or I would call them Christians, but they were Gentiles who follow Yeshua, Gentile believers in Yeshua. And one of them came from Oregon. Now, I didn't know the New Testament. I didn't know the Old Testament existed, let alone the New Testament. You know, I'm born in an atheistic, secular community as the kibbutz. But he was talking about Yeshua. He was a lovely man, yeah, but I didn't understand anything. And after a few years, he left the kibbutz, and I was left in my sins, not knowing right from left. But then came another, I would say, this time from Korea. She came as a volunteer, as a tourist or a volunteer to the kibbutz to participate in the ulpan, even though she wasn't Jewish, but she believed in Yeshua. And finally, I asked her, what's going on? Why are you here? Why do you love Israel? Why do you think Jews are the smartest people in the world? I mean, you know me. So what's going on? And she said, if you really want to know, she was really polite. If you really want to know, read the New Testament. And first, what is the New Testament? What do you mean the New Testament? I didn't know there was an old one, as I said. So what do you mean the New Testament, what the Christians believe? Okay. Well, I went to my parents' house, and praise the Lord, they had a Bible, an Old Testament and a New Testament that they received from a missionary, maybe a few years before. And I opened it, trying to find the New Testament. It's got to be somewhere, probably in the end. So I'm flipping the pages. I'm getting a little bit aggravated because I can't find it. But then, after Divrei Hayamim, how do you say, Chronicles?
Chronicles, yeah.
Chronicles finished, I see the Bible doesn't end. There's more. I said, well, it has to be the New Testament. And I see the Gospel according to Matthew, the headline in Hebrew, of course. And I'm thinking, wait a minute. Should I even read this? I mean, isn't that a recipe for anti-Semitism? I didn't much, but I knew that the New Testament was written by the Pope, and it's probably full of evil stuff against Jewish people. So I was a little bit hesitant to open, but curiosity was bigger than me, and I opened it and I read the first verse, and it blew in my face, literally, because I read Yeshua, the son of David. This is the genealogy of Yeshua the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And I thought, what's going on here? That's the book of the Christians. That was written in the Vatican by the Pope. Doesn't make sense. So I went back to that Korean girl and asked her, is that the New Testament? You sure that's the New Testament you told me to read? Because that's what I read. And she said, yes, that's exactly it. So I kept on reading, and other than the conviction of the Holy Spirit, I don't know what was going on, because I was drawn to that figure of Yeshua, and I knew, maybe for the first time in my life, I knew that I was reading truth, that this must be truth. There was no way for me to explain it, but I just knew it. Anyway, times go on, and this Korean girl and I become really close, and we become good friends, and we decide we want to spend time together forever. We want to marry, but she wants to convert. She wants to convert to she wants to become she wants to be a part of the Jewish people, the Jewish state. So okay, do whatever you want. I don't care. I'm a secular kibbutznik. I don't, I'm reading about Yeshua, but I don't know exactly what's going on. You want to convert? Do whatever you want. So she goes to this Orthodox religious kibbutz, a different kibbutz, to convert, because they have a conversion ulpan that they got permission to do from the state of Israel, and they have a condition. If you're dating someone, both of you and the guy you're dating, has to go through the conversion together, even though I'm Jewish from both sides. So okay, I say, well, okay, what do I have to do? I have to study in the yeshiva for 1 year. So I happen to find myself going twice a week from the kibbutz to a small town near the kibbutz to study in the yeshiva. And by the way, that was the head of the yeshiva was the same rabbi that did my circumcision in the kibbutz. So I find myself study in his yeshiva 2 days a week with a wise disciple that they assigned me, because you study in chavruta together. And I'm as I told you before, I'm reading the New Testament. I'm reading it at night, and during the day I'm studying the Talmud in the yeshiva. And all of a sudden I realized, wait a minute, Golan, you're not studying Christianity versus Judaism. You're studying one Judaism versus another Judaism. And the more I studied, the more I saw that there's only one Judaism who naturally or supernaturally continues the Old Testament, the Tanakh. And the more I studied in the yeshiva, I understood that only the New Testament could be the real Judaism of God that continues exactly with the hope that the Bible left for the coming of the Messiah. And this is in a nutshell.
And I think that's the perfect place to continue on to the discussion, because essentially, if you say if somebody who is a Christian or a Messianic Jew, or somebody says to a Jewish person, another Jewish person, that the New Testament continues the Old Testament, or that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, or anything like this, you're instantly met with, "What are you, nuts? There's no Jesus found in the Old Testament. There's no hint of it. There's nothing like it. Like, what are you talking about?" But if you actually analyze the contradictions or the conflict, you'd have to presuppose the rabbinic interpretation. For example, the rabbinic interpretation says that all prophecy, all divine inspiration in the form of prophecy, ended with Malachi, with the prophet Malachi.
Exactly.
But that's a rabbinic interpretation. So if you don't accept the rabbinic interpretation, you're free to read the New Testament and see it as the continuation of the Old Testament. So what I want to focus on...
Asher, I love it when you mentioned Malachi, because Bible scholars are saying the last prophet was Malachi, and Mark finishes the first gospel. Mark, according to scholars, Mark finished exactly with the hope that Malachi left. So that's what I'm talking about when I read the Talmud, or the Mishnah tractate Brachot. Compare that to Mark. what's
Right.
better continues the biblical hope for
So
a
the
Messiah.
rabbinic system is saying you're reading all these interpretations into it to get your view, but it's actually the rabbinic interpretation that has to review everything through a different lens to then counter the claims of Christianity or Messianic Judaism. Right? I'm just
Yes.
going to pause here for 1 second because I have a fan I need to adjust. I think my fan was making it go like flickering. So so essentially, if you can understand that the rabbinic interpretation came later, meaning there obviously was, and I think we can all agree here, there's obviously traditions of the Jewish people that predate the Second Temple that were
Yep.
developed along the way. Obviously, they don't go back to Moses, and we'll get into that. But obviously, the Pharisees didn't start in the first century. But the codified Jewish law of the Oral Torah, as we know it today, there's no record of what they believed until 200 years or so after the life of Jesus. And so it's actually a later document than the New Testament, in many ways formed as a reaction. So that's what I want to give you the floor for right now, to kind of explain how, and this is your field of expertise, I can do it somewhat, but I know that you know it more to the depth. So to kind of give an explanation of how it is that we come to the understanding that the rabbinic interpretation is actually a later development that is in many ways designed to counter the claims of the New Testament.
You know that that's exactly what modern Israeli scholars, professors, some secular, some even religious, are beginning to identify. They're beginning to talk about the Christian roots of the Jewish faith, and they mean messianic roots of the rabbinic, because they're beginning to realize that the documents of the New Testament are much earlier than anything we have from the oral law. Now, when you grow up in Israel, you believe that, of course, Moses got the oral law and the written law, but when you study it more, you realize that the Pharisees only entered the historical stage, maybe, if you want to push it, the second century BC. Second century BC, when we start seeing in Jewish documents the
Alexander
term
Dunaeus.
Pharisee. Exactly, the term Pharisee. So second century BC. But the funny thing is, and most Jewish people don't know that, they say, okay, so Rabbi Judah the Prince, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, okay, he edited the Mishnah. He wrote the Mishnah in the second and third century AD. But you say, well, no, wait a minute. No. The first time you hear the names of the rabbis, other than Rabban Gamliel, because he appears in the New Testament, but the first Jewish mention of Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, Yochanan ben Zakkai, is by a letter that Shrir Gaon, one of the Geonim in the between the 9th and 10th century, wrote. So the first written evidence for the people of the Mishnah, the heroes of the Mishnah, appears only something like 700 years after Rabbi Judah the Prince lived. And not only that, the first written copy of the Mishnah, of the whole Mishnah, is called, Parma copy or Kaufman, and it's only from the 12th or 13th century AD. So can you imagine? We're supposed to believe that a set of rules was given from Moses 1500 years before the time of the New Testament, and was somehow written exactly when the Pharisees entered the stage of history, but you don't see it. You don't see any evidence, any archaeological, historical evidence until the 13th or 12th century AD. Amazing. Can you imagine if I tell you Yeshua said that and Matthew wrote this and John wrote that, but we have it only 1,000 years later. We have written evidence for the saying of Yeshua 1,000 years later, after the times of the New Testament. And this is what we have in the Mishnah. Three
By
handwriting copies of the
contrast, you
Mishnah.
have the New Testament written, and there was I think scholarship has said a lot of the time that it's John is the last book written. Um,
Yeah.
Sometime 90 to 120 AD. But even that, there's speculation that it's even earlier because
Asher,
there's no mention in
there's a
John of the
recent
sacrifices ending or the temple being destroyed.
Asher, there's a recent Jewish, he's secular, Jewish scholars that he's saying he's secular, Jewish scholar in Israel. He's saying he believes all the New Testament was written before the destruction of the temple, all of it.
I saw that's what I'm referencing because I saw recently that somebody was bringing up the point. You'd think that in Hebrews or in John or in Revelation or in any of the later, well, Hebrews is probably earlier, but you'd see some kind of reference to see the temple was destroyed. Look, it was a correct prediction. You'd think that would
Yes.
be in there if they were going to use that as a proof, right? It's pretty obvious that it was before the temple was destroyed. Otherwise, they would have been talking about it nonstop.
Yeah. And
So that's really
what's
interesting.
ironic? Yeah, what's ironic that some Israelis, religious Israelis that I'm a friend of, they tell me, yeah, but it was written 10 years or 15 years, the letters of Paul and the gospel, sometimes 30 years after. How can you believe it? And I'm saying, are you kidding me? Excuse me. How can you believe? How can you believe Akiva ever existed, let alone anything that Akiva said or
Alexander the
wrote?
Great. Alexander the
Yeah,
Great.
but forget Alexander because the Jews don't care for Alexander. But what about Akiva? What about Yohanan ben Zakkai? What about their saying and writings? How can you believe anything if the first mention is in Igeret Shri Gaon, a guy that wrote between the 10th and 9th century A.D. How? So that's why there's another scholar, an Israeli scholar, who says that Akiva and all the rest of them were all myth, mystical figures. Now, I actually believe that some of them were actually living figures, not fictional. But some Israeli scholars are not afraid to say, wait a minute, if the gap is so deep, so big between the figure itself and the first mention of the figure, maybe Akiva and all his friends, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Joshua, maybe they're all mystical figures. You
So
know what
you're
I
saying
mean?
something here I didn't even know because from what I understood, the Mishnah is compiled second, third century, and that we have proof of that. But you're saying we don't even have proof of that.
I'll give you a
That's
story, Asher. A true story. I'm in the Hebrew University, studying for my MA, Hebrew, and minding my own business. I find myself in a class for the Talmud.
you're saying
The,
years
the, the
ago.
course is about the Talmud, the oral law, and especially the Talmud. And the professor is a religious guy with the kippah sruga. How would you say kippah sruga in English?
Like a knitted kippah.
Exactly. For Orthodox is a knitted kippah. The professor. Now, in the beginning of the course, the first class came an ultra Orthodox student, with a black blazer and a white shirt, and he listens. He sits in the first row and he listens. And the professor is saying, "Listen." The professor is saying, "Yes, Rabbi Judah the Prince edited the Mishnah in the second and third century, but he edited it orally." Now we were shocked. What do you mean how can you edit something orally? Well, he said, I cannot tell you that it was written because we don't have any evidence. The first evidence appears in the 9th and 10th century with the Geonim, and the first copy of the Mishnah, as I said, is the 12th. So the ultra orthodox student, where he was steam came out of his ears. He's like, are you crazy? Are you crazy? What are you talking about? Of course, he edited of course, it was written during the time of the Mishnah. And the professor was trying to explain, no, as historians, we cannot say that because we didn't find any evidence, any written evidence. And the funny thing was that it was the first class and the last class that I saw this ultra orthodox student. He was so aggravated, he couldn't stand it. The historical evidence. He couldn't stand it that it debunks, it rebukes everything he knows about the oral law, and it didn't show up anymore.
So when you get this question, I mean, we could go into. I made a video about it. You have books about it, demonstrating how the oral law cannot be back to Moses. So I want to get a little more into the details here with you that maybe I haven't had a chance to present, or things that I'm missing that you would know. So I want to take this opportunity to go through that. I understand, and I'm not familiar with it. There is internal evidence in the Mishnah and in the Talmud that show that it is by admission in response to Christianity. For example, admitting that it's so that the Greeks won't steal it, and so on. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, so there's a passage in actually it's a midrash. I don't know if how you say rabbinic commentary.
Rabbinic commentary or allegory or story. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a midrash which explains why wasn't the oral law written, but it goes even further. It says when Moses gave the two Torahs, God said you're only allowed to write the written Torah, and you are never allowed to write the oral Torah. Of course, this is adding to the commandments of the Torah, because nowhere the Torah says you're not allowed to write the oral Torah. There's no oral Torah. But never mind that. The Midrash says, but why? Why did Moses receive two Torahs? And they said that's the mystery, because there would come a time in the future where the Gentiles would say, "We are Israel. We are Israel because we copied the Torah to Greek and it belongs to us, and we are Israel." And God will tell the Gentiles, "I only know Israel by the mystery that I placed in Israel." And the mystery is the Mishnah. So whoever has the oral law is the real Israel. Now, of course, Israeli scholars are saying that this midrash wants to attack replacement theology, which of course I'm totally against. I'm totally against replacement theology. But that's an example for the scholars to show how the midrash is responding to the church fathers saying that we are the new Israel and the Bible belongs to us.
So it's an anachronistic claim that doesn't fit in the timeline of history. You'd have to already
exactly
understand that there are Gentiles who speak Greek who believe in the Old Testament, and that's what you're trying to refute. And I saw
exactly
an
now.
interesting debate with Eitan Eitan Bar, Eitan
Yes,
Bar, and an Orthodox rabbi. I didn't have a chance to watch the whole debate, but I caught bits and pieces while I was skimming through, where he says, and the reason why it wasn't written down is so that the Gentiles won't steal our Torah our oral Torah like they did with our written Torah. And I'm like, what a crazy, the Gentiles stole your Torah? Like, how is that even a concept? But that's neither here nor there. So
but
there's
you know why
basically,
it's you know why it's
yeah,
so sad, because thanks to Christian monks, we have the Maccabees, we have Jubilees, we have the external books which Christian monks copied. If it wasn't for Christian monks, we wouldn't have the what we call in Hebrew most of the Sfarim Chitzonim.
the
You call them
Deuterocanon.
the Apocrypha. You say in English the Epigrapha.
Depends who you ask, but Apocrypha or Deuterocanon, depending on if you're talking about
Exactly.
Catholic
So,
or.
so, 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 so only thanks to so-called Christians. I don't know if I don't judge their heart. Christian monks back in ages copied the book of Maccabees, the book of Jubilees, the many books which came between the Old Testament and the New Testament, copied them and preserved them for the Jewish people. And that's why we know. That's how we know about Hanukkah, thanks to
Right,
them. So blaming Christians, this is amazing. Instead of thanking them, we're blaming them. Now
right.
again, Asher, living in a kibbutz full of Holocaust survivors, I can understand all the hate, all the I could believe me personally, I can understand all the hate there is for what in the name of Christianity or in the name of Yeshua was done to the Jewish people. I can understand it. No,
So
I have
I
the
actually had a
same brothers.
conversation recently. I'm going to keep who it was private, somebody, a prominent person, but it was a private conversation, so I'm not going to go into too much of it or say who it was. Essentially, people are attacking the Vatican, the Catholic Church, for apologizing to the Jewish people now. Other groups of Christians are now attacking the Catholic Church, not only for saying nice things about Jews, which maybe they think is too far or whatever it is,
Mhm.
but for apologizing at all for anything, which I think everyone can agree that the Catholic Church committed atrocities against the Jewish people throughout history. It doesn't mean they're bad or their beliefs or theology is bad. It means there was bad people that did bad things, and an apology is
Yeah,
needed.
in Yad Vashem, in the Holocaust memorial thing in Jerusalem, there's a shderat etzim, row of trees that are planned for Chasidei
Mhm.
Umot Olam, righteous Gentiles from the nations, and many of them we're not told that as Israelis, but if you search the names, many of them were good
Catholic.
Catholics that really believed in Yeshua and
My
were willing
father's
to.
cousin, my father was born in 43. His cousin, who they adopted because her parents were killed, she was my father's from England. His cousins were in France. She was saved and protected by a Catholic family in France
That's
who
why I
protected her.
always tell Asher. That's why I'm always telling Israelis: don't judge a religion or a philosophy or a worldview by its abusers. You know what I mean?
Right. Exactly. 100%. And so going back to, so the Mishnah essentially is admitting to being an anachronistic claim and document that is a polemic essentially against against the
Oh,
Christian New Testament because it's now being written, so they have to write something down too and combat that. But there are claims. So we know that the Mishnah is supposedly compiled in the 3rd century, really much later that we have the first evidence of it. However, there's some archaeological evidence that claims that the Pharisaic tradition predates the writing of the Mishnah. But
yes.
that's not necessarily proof of the claims of the Mishnah. That's just that some of it goes back.
Yes, I want to show you an example of what they do in order to justify or say, you see the oral law in the Bible. So they find Daniel praying 3 times towards Jerusalem, and they say, you see, we do that. Daniel probably knew about the oral law, and they say, no, you took a tradition of Daniel and you embraced it. It doesn't say anything about. It doesn't mean anything about the oral law. The fact that you borrowed some of the traditions that were already there doesn't mean that it's part of the oral law.
So
You
I think
you,
what they're
you
asking
embrace.
is why would Daniel do it if it wasn't the oral law that he had to keep? But the
Yes,
question
but
then
we
is
don't
in
know.
response, why didn't anyone else do it? Why didn't King David do it?
Yeah, and we know that David says that he prayed 7 times. So is that anti-oral law? I mean, what doesn't have? And wait, even praying itself, there's not one commandment in the Torah to pray. And we have the whole tractate of Brachot, the first and biggest tractate in the Mishnah, tells you how to pray, when to pray, with whom to pray, everything, when to pray. Actually, the biggest, most important tractate, Brachot, is the beginning of the Mishnah. And scholars are now realizing how revolutionary the Mishnah is compared to anything Jewish before it, let alone the Old Testament, because it's the first Jewish writings, the Mishnah, that opens with a question. Yeah? Until when you can read the Shema in the evening prayer? Until when you can say the evening prayer before it's too late, before it's the morning prayer? It's the first time that we have anything like that. There's Jewish people are asking questions about the halakha as if it's not given from Moses. Can you imagine? Can you
Can you
imagine
explain a little bit
Moses
about
saying,
that? How that's more evidence that it's a Greek debate text as opposed to a authentically biblical text?
and that's my next point, that not only that it opens with a question, until when you can pray the last, until when it's too late to pray the evening prayer, before it's morning, before it's time for the morning prayer. Not only that, there's given 3 different answers by 2 rabbis and then majority rabbinic. So Eliezer is saying until the priests are coming to eat dinner. Let's make it simple. Then the rabbis are saying until midnight. And Rabban Gamliel is saying, well, until the first light. So not only that it opens with a question, it gives you 3 different answers. And you're supposed to believe that this is brought down by Moses. But scholars are mentioning even something more astonishing. Why does it start with the quote of Rabbi Eliezer? The Mishnah starts with a question, and the first answer starts with Rabbi Eliezer. Now, if the oral law came from Moses, why quote Rabbi Eliezer first? Why not Joshua or Ezra or Isaiah? Isaiah says until this. Elijah says until that. Ezra is saying, no, guys, you're wrong. Why quote Rabbi Eliezer? Why start Eliezer? And it gets even worse. Scholars are saying, wait a minute, if we start quoting Eliezer, we have a problem now, because we don't know what Eliezer himself studied. Who did Eliezer quote? If the Mishnah first quote comes from Eliezer, because the first answer comes, Rabbi Eliezer says until the priests go to eat dinner. Who did Rabbi Eliezer himself quote? What did Eliezer study in the yeshiva? And scholars don't know. Religious scholars are saying we don't have an idea. In other words, we have nothing prior to Rabbi Eliezer because he's the first person quoted. In other words, if we want to make it more simple for New Testament believers,
if it's an unbroken tradition, there would be an earlier person to quote.
Exactly. And we can say, if let's say Paul, Shaul, we know Shaul studied in Gamliel Yeshiva. What did Paul study? We don't know. It doesn't tell us. But definitely we can say that it started in the time of Paul or Hillel or during these centuries, because we don't have anything to know, any evidence to know what did Eliezer studied in their yeshiva. We don't, because the Mishnah starts with Eliezer. So you see how many problems we have with the Mishnah. This is why one of the top Israeli scholars is saying the Mishnah, we should start seeing the Mishnah as an independent manifest or a law of the Pharisees. Has nothing to do with the Torah, with the written Torah. It's an independent law, and we should study it as an independent law, codex of law that has nothing to do with the written Torah.
Well, what's interesting, the only evidence to show that the oral law as we know it today even existed at the time of Jesus, the irony is that it only exists because Rabbi Gamliel is mentioned in the New Testament, and that Jesus says to the Pharisees, or to the people following the Pharisees, hey, there's these rabbis with this tradition and so on. But it doesn't say what that tradition is. It doesn't say that they're not just teaching the law.
Asher, that's exactly what I'm telling my Orthodox friends, my Jewish religious friends. I'm telling you, I believe Gamliel existed, and Nicodemus, Nagdimon, which also appears in the Talmud, I believe existed thanks to the New Testament. If I was dependent on the oral law, how do I know that Gamliel exists? Josephus doesn't mention him. Church fathers, Jerome mentions Hillel, Shammai, and Akavia, which may be Akiva. Scholars saying maybe it's Akiva. So Jerome mentions only three of them. But Gamliel, Rabbi Joshua, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Judah the Prince, Yochanan ben Zakkai, never mentioned. So if it wasn't, you're right, if it wasn't for the New Testament, we would have thought that it's all a myth. The whole thing is a myth, and Gamliel never existed.
So rabbis will point out to that. A certain individual, I'm sure we're both aware of, will say, hey, but look, in, I think it's Matthew 23, where he says, the Pharisees sit in the seat of Moses, but it doesn't say sit in the seat of Moses. That's not what it actually translates to. It's more like sat down in the seat of Moses.
Exactly.
But he says,
yes.
But what he says afterwards is they've created heavy burdens. He says they sit in the seat of Moses because they're teaching you the law, but they've created heavy burdens. So he's obviously describing a situation, because Orthodox Jews will say, even Jesus says the rabbis are authentic. He doesn't say that. He says they are there to teach you. That's authentic. But they've made heavy burdens that they don't even keep. So it's, if you're using that as proof, it's proof that it's
Asher,
added.
as much as they teach you, yes, exactly. And as much as they teach you the law of Moses itself, the Torah, believe them and listen to them, because Yeshua himself said, if you read the Torah, if you believed Moses, you would have believed me. So as much as somebody teaches you the Torah, of course follow him. The Torah is divine, the Torah is holy. But what happens when they deviate, like Yeshua tells them in Mark 7, by your traditions you make the word of God void, but by no effect.
Right. So that's really interesting to use the New Testament as proof of the rabbinical tradition, when all it proves is that the rabbis had an authentic position to teach, but not their tradition.
Exactly. And there's another Jewish professor, by the way, he's also Orthodox, he's also a religious professor, Daniel Boyarin, which says in the first century there were many Judaisms, many sects in Judaism. There wasn't the Judaism. There's many Judaisms. Only after Daniel Boyarin is saying, only after the temple was destroyed, we were left with two Judaisms. Yeah, Messianic Judaism and Rabbinic Judaism, and of course, Rabbinic Judaism became what we know today as Judaism. Yeah, but that was, he said, only after the destruction of the first temple. Before that, the Jewish world had many sects of Judaisms competing each other.
I find it very funny, something that comes up a lot because you say the competing sects. There's also sects that were never there because they left Israel in the first temple, such as the Ethiopian Jews. And
Exactly.
when I found out about it, I was like, I didn't realize that they made them convert when they came to Israel, which is,
Yeah,
in
that's
my
really
opinion, it's
sad.
sick. It's sick, because they're Jewish people within a tradition back to the first temple. But I remember it jogged my memory because I remember sitting in a group of people when I was working in security, and in the group, there was me. I was still Orthodox at the time. There was another guy who was an Orthodox Jewish Ethiopian guy, who now follows Rabbinic Judaism. His family doesn't. Um, and in the group, there was a Christian Arab and a Muslim Bedouin Arab, all together sitting, drinking coffee on while we're in security work in training at the time. Um, and somebody made a comment. Somebody else in the group said something like, "Oh, isn't this so cool? Look, you see so many people from different backgrounds here." And he said, "There's a Muslim, there's a Christian, there's a Jew, and an Ethiopian." And the Ethiopian guy goes, "What?"
Wow,
He says, "There's two Jews, a
unbelievable.
Christian and a Muslim. There's not a Jew and an Ethiopian. Like, what are you talking about?"
So,
It was the most, and
Asher,
I'm
if
just
I
like,
can
I'm
tell
sitting
you,
there, like, I put my coffee down. I'm like, "What? Because he's Ethiopian? He's
so
not Jewish? What are you talking about?"
I can tell you a similar story with a different background, a different context. But we in One for Israel Ministries, what we're trying to show both to Gentiles and to our Jewish brothers and sisters that still don't follow Yeshua. What we want to show that Messianic Judaism is another Judaism. And there was a convention in Brooklyn by a messianic ministry. Messianic ministry held a convention in Brooklyn maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and a messianic Jew with a head covering, a messianic Jew stands on the platform, on the stage, and he looks at the audience, and he said, "Isn't it lovely? Isn't it wonderful to see at last Jews and Christians getting together?" And I'm thinking, what do you mean Jews and Christians? Jews is an ethnic thing. Christian is a faith thing. What do you mean Jews and Christians? You can say Jews and Gentiles, but what do you mean Jews? You yourself,
Are you
you the
Jewish Christian?
presenter, you yourself a Messianic Jew. So you're a Christian Jew. So what do you mean? It's so lovely to see Jews and Christians are getting to. Can you imagine that I would go in Dubai or Abu Dhabi? I would go on the stage and say, "Oh, this is so wonderful to see Muslims and Arabs finally getting together." What do you mean Muslims and Arabs? Muslim is a faith. Arabs is an ethnic, and
Right,
most Muslims are Arabs. What do you mean Muslims and Arabs? You're mixing
right.
oranges and apples. You know what I
It's
mean?
different categories people don't understand.
Exactly.
So
This is why
going,
when I talk about
yeah,
Asher, when I'm talking about the anti-missionaries, the Jewish, I don't call them anti-missionaries. I call them Orthodox missionaries,
anti-Semites.
rabbinic missionaries. They're missionaries exactly like myself. We both,
I made a
you know,
video about that, and I don't want to segue from it too long. To me, it's very interesting that if I embrace Christianity, suddenly I'm not Jewish anymore, but people can still come and proselytize Judaism to me because once a Jew, always a Jew. So you're deciding the categories that are permitted to proselytize to, but when a Christian decides the categories that are permitted to proselytize to, you think that's crazy and predatory, and but it's the same thing.
Professor Martin Buber, again in the Hebrew University, passed away maybe 50 years ago. Professor Martin Buber used to say that both Christianity and Judaism both founded. He say that with Pharisaical Jews, Akiva and Paul. So he said that the two biggest world religions, or the most famous world religion, Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity, are founded by Pharisaical Jews, Paul and Akiva.
Right. It's from that tradition. I mean, but so going back to that though, obviously it's a double standard with how you're allowed to preach your message, because they'll say, well, we're only preaching to Jews. It's like you decide who's a Jew and not a Jew and what the categories of permitted preaching are, but you'll attack somebody else who, well, they say everyone's a Christian really and should be a
And
Christian. So
by the way, you said we're only preaching to Jews. I'm telling my religious friends, what do you mean only preaching to Jews? Akiva is not Jewish. Rabbi Meir is not Jewish. Onkelos is not Jewish. Shmaya and Avtalion are not Jewish. Your founding fathers in the Talmud and in the Mishnah are not Jewish. So how did they, if you're only preaching to Jews, how come your founding fathers, the founding
are
fathers of the
all
Mishnah are not
converts,
Jewish? Yeah,
all
exactly.
converts, every single one. So I want to go back a little bit because I think that's an interesting the topic of the back to the oral law. So the Ethiopian tradition, obviously, people in Israel and Jews around the world will say, well, they're not really Jews. They just sometime along the way got Jewish culture. I mean, that's obviously a ridiculous claim, because if they just got some Jewish culture and there was an oral law, they would have some oral law with it, which they don't have. So either way, the Ethiopian Jews are a problem for the rabbinic tradition. Um, so that goes back to the second temple, to the first temple when they left, and that's why they don't have the oral law. But then the answer will then come from the rabbinic side. Well, how do you keep any of these laws from the Old Testament? Tefillin, I mean, we have evidence of tefillin from in the Dead Sea area with the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's obviously an older tradition. And how would you do that if you didn't have an oral law? How would you know how to slaughter? How would you know how to do tefillin? How would you know how to do any of these things?
And that goes back exactly to what Professor Daniel Boyarin said. And there's a different scholar, Israeli scholar, who said something similar. Imagine the Jewish world in the first century BC and AD, the century, many isms, and each one of them had, you can say, kind of an oral law or a tradition, a different tradition. So we're not saying there's no oral law. I keep many of the oral law myself. If you live in Israel, it's hard not to keep the oral law. How do you eat no kosher? All the food in the supermarket is kosher. So we keep most of the oral law ourselves, but we only say the oral law is not divine. The rabbinic oral law is found. It's not it. The only problem we have is not with the oral law as it's in and of itself, is with the claim that the oral law was given by Moses from God. That's the problem. That's why I'm telling my religious friends, when I speak to you about Yeshua, I didn't say anything about the oral law. You can keep the oral law. Did I say anything about the oral law? I said, how can you reconcile a sinful man? How can you reconcile yourself with a holy God? That's why we have the right metavech, mediator between us and God. I didn't tell you anything about your pact. As long as the oral law doesn't contradict the Bible, of course, keep the oral law. I didn't say anything about the oral law.
So as long
The
as it's
only
a
thing is,
cultural tradition, it's fine.
yeah. And we emphasize it, the problem we have it when you say that Moses came down with the oral law. That's the problem. And no sect in the Jewish world that had tradition said that it came from God. The Essenes or the Dead Sea Scroll writers, they had traditions, but never they say it's an oral law we got from Moses. Never you find it. You only find it with the Pharisees, even though all the other Jewish sects had their traditions. Of course, you got to have traditions. How do you build the sukkah? How do you decorate the sukkah? How do you slaughter a chicken? The Torah doesn't say anything about eating chickens. How do you
So you're
slaughter a
saying the
chicken?
technical requirements that they're saying you need an oral law to do those are not even the important parts. You're presupposing the rabbinic attitude to say you need a rabbinic interpretation for it. So when God says slaughter, he says, so this comes up a lot. Well, God says slaughter as I have commanded, but we don't see it anywhere there. How do you slaughter then? How is God commanded? You're saying the technical detail is not the important part. People listening to that back then would have known how to slaughter an animal pretty
So
definitively.
So I'm talking to a rabbi, and he tells me, yeah, but the Ethiopians also had an oral law, and I say exactly, but their oral law is different than yours. So what do you do
Completely.
with that? Of course, they had an oral tradition that they kept, because the Torah, there's a Jewish scholar called, actually he's Orthodox also, Joshua Berman. Yoshua Berman, and he's in Bar Ilan, and he's Bar Ilan University, and he says the Torah is like constitution. The laws of the Torah are like a constitution. So of course you would have some kind of tradition to keep them, and we have many traditions. The Ethiopian Jews also had traditions. Why do you not accept them? Because they contradict your oral law? Oh, so don't tell me that they had an oral law and it's proof for an oral law, because it's different. Their oral law contradicts your oral law. So you have to dismiss them? No. Why can't you embrace them?
So would you say that the that Philin that they found, let's say Dead Sea Scroll area, this is proof of some kind of concept of something you would tie physically to your arm that went back to Moses, or not even that?
I think that Philin, and I know it could sound extreme, so I apologize in advance, but I think it's a kind of a kamea. How do you say amulet? Kamea?
Yeah, amulet.
And I'm sure that the rabbis picked it up. I don't think they invented it. I'm sure it was before the Pharisees entered the historical stage, and they just embraced it and converted this amulet, this kamea that was used by certain Jews. But some rabbis even admit that the totafot in Deuteronomy 6 are a sign, but a spiritual sign.
So there's
That
no
it's not a
indication that it
physical.
has to be physically tied to you. So
Exactly.
I have somebody in the comments on one of my videos, they said, look, they found Philin at the Dead Sea, and how would you tie this? It says tie it to your arm, bind it to your arm, and bind it to your head. I said, first of all, it doesn't say bind it to your head. It says bind it between your eyes. So I don't know why you're putting tefillin here when it says bind it between your eyes. But
Yes.
also it says in Proverbs, take wisdom and tie it around your neck. Is that supposed to be
Yeah,
taken literally also?
exactly. Now, Asher, I would need your help in English, because the Mishnah actually admits that tefillin is a kamea, is a lucky charm, because it says there that I think in Tractate Shabbat, but either Sanhedrin or Shabbat, it says that a certain woman was koma'at for a husband, the
Mm.
tefillin, and they use the verb koma'at from the word kamea. So I don't know if you can
So
explain it better in
koma'at,
English.
so koma'at would be like the
Komat with a
verb form.
kuvav ayin mem. Komat from the word kamea.
So in Hebrew, essentially, for anyone watching, the root, the shoresh of a word, can be can be manipulated by prefixes and suffixes to become a verb or a noun in different tenses. So the root here for the amulet is being turned into a verb form to, I guess, amuletize. On, it's like a made up word. You can
Exactly.
only do that in Hebrew. You can't do it in English.
Exactly.
But
And it's amazing that the Mishnah would use that word and not use a different word for korechet, kosheret, just
right.
tie. Why don't just use the word tie? Why use the word that is the root word for kamea, for an amulet that she was emulating, as you said, that feeling was on his arm, admitting it's. And of course you cannot, there's other passages in the Talmud that says that feeling are used as a kameat for against evil
Right.
spirits and stuff like that. So there's other passages, but even the Mishnah, which is earlier than the Talmud, admits without showing, admits that it's an amulet.
So what I think a lot of the anti-missionary rabbis get into is when you try to bring anything up, they say, well, don't use the oral law as proof for anything because you don't believe in it. And it's like, no, we don't believe that it's definitive from God or binding, but it is evidence of Jewish history and culture and thought. And
Exactly.
so what I want to get into now maybe a little bit is there are oral traditions that I guess the written copies predate the Mishnah, Seder Olam Rabbah and stuff like that. For example, that are validating to the fact that Jews prior to the Rashi, Rambam, maybe earlier than that, but essentially the later polemical changes, that the Jewish world prior to that believed in Christian type theology. They rejected Jesus, but they believed in the same theology. And I'm not just saying that there's a Messiah or that he's divine or that God can exist in three persons. I'm even talking about the insufficiency of the law, for example, which we
Asher,
see. Yeah.
There's a scholar, a woman, a scholar, Israeli. I don't know if she's religious or not, but she made the bold claim that until the Rambam came, Jews didn't have a problem with anthropomorphic. I don't know how to say that word, but God
Anthropomorphizing
appearing as a
God.
man. Yeah,
Right.
the Jews never had a problem with God appearing as a man until the time of the Rambam. This is a Jewish scholar, not a follower of Yeshua. Can you
Are you
imagine
familiar
until the
with Echa Rabbah, when
yes, love it.
God walks into the temple and Abraham
Yes,
walks into the temple and they walk holding hands through the temple?
look,
And
there's Asher. There's an amazing book ascribed to Akiva and Rabbi, either Rabbi Joshua or Rabbi Eliezer, two of the most, most famous rabbis of the Mishnah. And the book is called Shiur Koma. How would you translate Shiur Koma in English? I don't know.
the lesson of heights.
Yeah,
I don't
and
know.
this, what's amazing about this book, now, of course, the written copies are really late, medieval, but this book is ascribed to Akiva and his friend. And this book gives you and the anatomy of God, the size of his nose, the gap between his eyes, the size of his finger, the names of his finger. Then, and it's amazing, an amazing mystical
When
book.
is this text from?
Yeah, anybody that watches us can search in Google and write Shiur Koma, an amazing text. Now, of course, when you tell it to Orthodox Jews, they would tell you, yeah, but that's only the pshat. It's allegorical, and but that's your opinion. The text never says it's allegorical. The text itself never said this is only the pshat. How do you say pshat?
The simple meaning of
Literal?
the text, the
Yeah,
literal meaning.
the text is just there. If it's not comfortable to you, it's your problem, but it gives you the measures
So
of
the first time in Jewish history, we have the Torah talking about God standing on the Mount of Olives, God eating with, or not eating with, but the people eating and sitting with God on Mount Sinai. You have God coming in a human form to Abraham. You have God sitting on a throne with fire and all kinds of stuff. All these different times that God is described. Obviously, this topic for another video, too much time to talk about, of the revelations of God in form, but I think you guys have tons of material on that people should go
yeah,
watch
look,
on.
Asher, in Exodus, I think it's 33, but it might be 34. When Moses is asking God, show me your glory, and God is saying, nobody can see my face and live. Then it says God showed him his back, right? It says God showed him, I'll show you kapai, achorai, yeah, my back. And Rashi is saying God showed Moses how to tie the tefillin. So God gave Moses an example. So you want to tell me that you Orthodox Jews don't believe that God had a body? How to tie the
So
tefillin on
I
his
was gonna
his
I was
body, on
gonna
his.
go somewhere else with this, but since you bring up Rashi anthropomorphizing God, I think this is a beautiful place to go with the discussion. So really, there's a few earlier figures, but the big two that are quoted, cited, and change the Jewish view of God and the Messiah and Messianic prophecy are Maimonides and Rashi. Rashi being 11th century, Maimonides 12th century. But they do it in two different ways that are contradictory to each other. So Rashi undermines the Messianic prophecies more so, and Rambam undermines the nature of God from an earlier
Yes.
standpoint. So Rambam is a Aristotelian Islamic philosopher, essentially. Um, Under Muslim guidance and influence in his area, he's not allowed to say certain
Mhm.
things in that area, and people miss that point entirely. If he said God exists in such and such a way around Muslims of the time who are both Islamic and Aristotelian in their philosophy, they would behead him. So he's not even allowed to talk in that terminology there. He's
Yes.
allowed to criticize Islam or Christianity, but he's not allowed to say things blasphemous about God from a Muslim standpoint. So people miss that entirely. But the other thing is, he's saying you can't anthropomorphize God. It's all allegory. There's no example of God with a form. Anything that you ever say has to be only God describing himself from the Torah, and even that's allegory to try to understand. But there's nowhere earlier in the tradition that ever says that. And Rashi changes messianic prophecies. Isaiah 53 is about Israel, so on, but he does anthropomorphize God. So they're
But you know what's funny? That
contradicting.
yeah, I don't know how you say the phrase in English, but Rashi is speaking from both sides of his mouth, because in Sanhedrin, in the Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Sanhedrin, there's a discussion on the name of Messiah. And some call it Menachem, some call it other names. And then they're saying scholars, the Chachamim, the wise rabbis are calling him the leopard of the house of the rabbis,
The
Metzorah.
leper, like
Metzorah.
Mitzorah.
And they quote Isaiah 53 in the Talmud in Tractate Sanhedrin. They quote it. And Rashi, in his commentary of the Talmud, is saying that's the name of the Messiah. The passage is talking about no. So Rashi when he interprets the Talmud, he agrees that Isaiah 53 is talking about the Messiah. But when he interprets Isaiah 53, the actual text, he's saying it's about Israel. So I would ask Rashi, wait a minute, Rashi, do you agree with the Talmud? Tractate Sanhedrin, I think it's 98 something, page 98. Do you agree with the Talmud that Isaiah 53 is a messianic prophecy about a single figure Messiah? Or who are you preaching to, Rashi? When should we believe you? When you say that, or when you
Rashi
say
didn't
this?
know that you could pull up two tabs on Google at the same time and put them side by side. Yeah, he
And
didn't.
with
He
the
didn't know that.
Rambam, with the Rambam, the problem when you go into that rabbit hole of the Greek philosophy, you end up losing the entire Old Testament, because then Rambam would tell you, well, Adam and Eve were not physical figures. Abraham was not necessarily a figure, a physical, and Noah. It's all allegorical stories. So if you take the Rambam to its extreme conclusion, what do you end up with? You know what I mean? So you
You
got to
end up
be
with a
really
fable,
careful.
like a mythological story.
Exactly, Job. There's a discussion in the Talmud if Job ever existed, and the Rambam is saying no, Job never existed. It was only a proverb, a mashal, allegory.
So I try to explain to people, and this is where I get, um, this is where I start to get demonized as a self-hating Jew and all kinds of stuff like that, for pointing out written things that are true in the text. This is not about Jewish people. This is about Jewish theology and text. We can go through the different figures, and I bring this up. People get really mad at me. They say you're trying to demonize one point to undermine Judaism, and it's a straw man. So I'll bring up that on flawed medical science from the 2nd century, Rabbi Eliezer says that to do a kosher circumcision, you have to suck the blood from the
Oh,
circumcision wound.
yes.
And people say you're being disgusting. A lot of Jews don't even agree with that. I don't personally agree with that. And you're just using it as a slam dunk, they call it, to try to make Jews look bad. I said, no, you're missing the deeper point. If Rabbi Eliezer, the great sage giving halachic ruling under divine providence, is saying something that we know now is medically flawed, is incorrect, and he's not only citing it as medical science, he's saying it's not a kosher brit if you don't do it, and you have to do it. And even Reform Jews today do it because it's part of the tradition. So if we know that he's wrong about that, and you yourself are condemning him for it, why do you listen to anything else Rabbi Eliezer says?
And
And in the
you
same
know,
way, yeah,
Asher, yes, when I speak, in the I'm taking my dog out to the park, so I meet other dog owners, and many of them are religious, so we became friends, and we see each other almost every evening in the park. So I talk to them, and when I tell them things that are against Rabbinic Judaism, I always emphasize it's not Judaism. I'm talking only about Rabbinic Judaism. Yeah? You're
right.
anti-Semite. How can you be anti-Semite? I tell them, wait a minute. You're cursing and attacking the most famous Jew in history, Yeshua, and you're calling me anti-Semite? Excuse me? Wait a minute. I can call you anti-Semite exactly. Who wrote the New Testament? Who was Yeshua if not the greatest rabbi, the greatest Jewish rabbi that ever lived? When you curse him,
Well,
aren't
this
you
is
an
another example of
anti-Semite?
speaking out of both sides of your mouth. So the anti-missionary will say, Paul's a liar. He wasn't even really a rabbi. Okay, so how did he know all these verses in Hebrew and be able to quote the Old Testament so efficiently? Not like everyone had a text of it. And they say, no, he didn't know it. He was quoting the Greek. But you said the Greek didn't exist yet.
By the way, Asher, there's a Jewish author in Israel, a really famous woman by the name of Yochi Brandes, who came from an ultra-Orthodox family. And she left the Orthodox world, but she's still traditional. And she wrote a book called the Pardes of Akiva, a Pardes shel Rabbi Akiva, in Hebrew, the orchard of Rabbi Akiva. And there she claims, she doesn't give the source, but she claims that there's a rabbinic tradition who says that Paul was the uncle of Rabbi Eliezer. So saying that Paul, if rabbis are saying that Paul wasn't Jewish, I think they're shooting themselves in the leg. You know what I mean?
So what's interesting is the rabbinic tradition eats itself in that way. So Rashi will say that that sorry, let's go back. There's a midrash that says that the Nishmat Kol Chai prayer was written by Peter. Now they attribute things to Peter that are actually Paul in doing so, but it's mixed up. But they attribute, so they're saying these are authentic rabbinical leaders. They're saying Peter infiltrated the Christians to change things, to distance from the heretics from the non-heretics. So you're admitting that the early apostles were rabbinic figures in that midrash. And so Rashi, in his polemics, says, no, anyone who says that, and I don't know where the source is, so somebody's going to have to find it for me. Anyone watching, maybe you have the source, but
I have it in Asher. You can find it in PDF in the internet. It's called Otzar Midrashim, and they have it. It's called Igeret de Shimon Keifa. Otzar Midrashim in Hebrew.
So the source of where Rashi answers it. So that one I have. Rashi's answer to it, I saw actually on a Jewish website where he says, if you say this legend, when the Beit HaMikdash, when the temple is rebuilt, you have to bring a sin offering. So Rashi is inventing sin offerings for sins that don't exist in the Torah because he doesn't want to admit that because Rashi doesn't like it. So earlier rabbis have a midrash that says, a tradition that says that these Christian apostles or early Jewish believers were rabbis. And Rashi's like, no, you can't say that. Don't say that. We can't give them that.
Now, Asher, this goes exactly to what we opened with. That's praise the Lord. We live in a fascinating time in scholarship, in Israeli scholarship, because more and more scholars are saying that the whole oral law, the concept of the oral law, not every dot or till, the concept of the oral law is as a whole is a reaction to the teaching of the disciples, to the teaching as we read in Acts 2, to the gospel, to the New Testament, the concept of the oral law. I'll tell you even more. Daniel Boyarin says both Rabbinic Judaism and Messianic Judaism both believe in the Logos. Only the Messianic Jews said Yeshua is the Logos, but Boyarin said the rabbis knew that this is what Messianic Jews believe, that they believe the Logos became Yeshua. Yeshua is the Logos. So they also believed in Logos, but their Logos is the oral law. Now, if you can find Yeshua in the Old Testament, the rabbis would say we can find our Logos also in the Old Testament. You see what I mean? So more and more scholars are now seeing Rabbinic Judaism as a reaction to Messianic Judaism.
Beautiful. And I think you're close to your time limit here, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
You have to go. So it was a pleasure having you on. If you could briefly, first of all, where can people find more of your videos on the topic? Is One for Israel on
YouTube channel One for Israel. There we have also a website One for Israel, but in Israel we call the Israel College of the Bible, but outside of Israel, the One for Israel YouTube page, a website, One for Israel Ministries. Thank you, Asher.
And thank you so much for coming on. And what would you say before leaving would be maybe a few good sources for people, maybe non-Messianic, non-Christian Israeli biblical scholars to look up their work on these topics?
Yeah, so I would say Daniel Boyarin, which writes, he writes in English, but most of his books are translated. So Daniel Boyarin, and there's another young scholar, I think from Tel Aviv University, Ishai Rosentzvi. Ishai Rosentzvi. His last name is two names together, Rosentzvi, and he also writes about this interaction in the first centuries between what he calls Judaism and Christianity. Of course, he means Messianic Judaism, but he doesn't say it, but he means
because he
Messianic Judaism.
because he's
Also,
not for, he's just a scholar.
yes, also Professor Israel Yuval. Israel Yuval also talks about the Christian roots of the rabbinic faith. He actually Israel Yuval, most of his books are in Hebrew, but he has a lecture in English in YouTube, and I think the name of the lecture is something like the Christian roots of the rabbinic religion, something like that. So you can find Israel Yuval also. But there's many young scholars that are now seeing Messianic Judaism for what it is. There's Asher, just a scholar who Yeshua is the most Jewish Jew that ever lived.
Wow. So those are a bunch of amazing sources. I have to look some of them up myself because I haven't familiarized myself. So I'm gonna look into them a little bit. People can watch your videos and your lectures online. One for Israel. So
I'll just give you another. Just remembered an amazing professor did her PhD in Harvard, although she's Israeli. Michal Bar Asher, Professor Michal Bar Asher, wrote in English but translated into Hebrew also. But you can Michal Bar Asher, and she says, Asher, it's blow your mind. She says the yeshiva, the whole concept of the yeshiva. I don't know how you translate the yeshiva in English.
Rabbinical study school. Like a
the Beit Midrash, the yeshiva is a copy of the monastery of the monastery. In Yiddish we say the monastery where the monks used to study and copy their writings. The whole concept of the yeshiva is a conversion of a monastery model. And she's an Israeli scholar, traditional Israeli scholar, Michal Bar Asher.
Oh, I didn't even know that. So yeah, those are amazing resources. Your videos online, one for Israel. Thank you so much, Dr. Golan Broshi, for joining me today. And I would love to do another one of these because I think we could do this for hours, a lot more depth to get into. So hopefully we can do that next time as well.
Thank you.
So
I hope so too. Thank you.